Alrighty. Well, for our next Utopias episode, I am very, very happy and honored to welcome one of my favorite colleagues, Ethan Zuckerman. Ethan is a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and he actually used to be a faculty member at the MIT Media Laboratory. But more than anything, I think of Ethan very much as an organizer, as a journalist, as someone who really looks at digital technologies, but technologies of all kinds with a real global lens, looking at citizen journalism and grassroots bloggers and technology creators and authors from all around the world, including in the global south. And that's partly because Ethan Zuckerman, again, along with Rebecca McKinnon, were the co-creators or founders of the incredible Global Voices Initiative, which is just completely symbiotic and harmonious with so much of the research that I do and care about. So I consider Ethan one of my favorite colleagues, one of my best colleagues, someone who's doing just really, really important work. So right now, Ethan has started an initiative called the Initiative for Digital Public Infrastructure that explores the civic and social role of internet platforms. And he advocates for approaches toward technology that treat platforms as public goods, not just profit-making ventures. He's worked in the startup space, the nonprofit space, and the blogosphere, and is the author of a book called Mistrust, which we are going to talk about, Why Losing Faith in Institutions Provides the Tools to Transform Them. So that is a huge, huge issue that we're staring at politically with the wave of right-wing populism and the presidency of Donald Trump. That Ethan is actually looking at the connections or the tensions between certain forms of populism and certain types of institutions, and how to actually revive and modernize institutions so they can support public interests in a way that responds to populist energy. Ethan's other book that I love is called Rewire: Digital Cosmopolitans in the Age of Connection, where he argues for the power of digital networks to support voices from different cultures, from different countries, where we're truly, truly talking with one another, rather than submitting blindly to platforms without any sense other than anxiety of what it's doing with our data and what we're connected to and what is or is not real. So we talk about big, big issues, including the connections between big tech and the Trump administration, the future of journalism, the power of civic media versus social media, how fringe voices have become normalized and actually become the new normal online with online platforms, and in general, his sort of vision for tech that actually supports us all rather than the very, very few at the cost of everybody else. So everybody enjoy this conversation. It's very fresh. It's very refreshing. We recorded originally in April, but this is a more timely conversation than ever. And please enjoy Ethan Zuckerman, our latest guest here on the Utopias podcast. Please, again, rate, review, and share this podcast with everybody and anybody. It's a labor of love, and it's a totally non-commercial venture. Thank you. So, Ethan, I'm super grateful to be in conversation with you. I've considered you a friend, a partner, a colleague, and someone I've been really inspired by your own path, your own practice, your own ethics and integrity for a very long time. So thank you for joining me in conversation.
Oh, thanks so much, Ramesh. It's great to spend some time with you, and I'm glad we have the chance to catch up, and I love what you're trying to do with the podcast.
Appreciate it. All right, so we got to start with some heavy stuff, and I know will have a lot to say about this. So, this word oligarchy has been circling around, specifically tied to tech oligarchy. We all know that tech is not just tech. What we call tech has taken over almost every vertical in our society, economically, politically, and so on. And we're now even hearing the term a little bit, snarkily, broligarchy circling around. I want to ask you, do you think this is an appropriate way of describing the current kind of economic, political, and technological situation in our country?
So I think you can argue that there have been super empowered individuals for quite some time. I think due to the current state of inequality we're experiencing, there's an awful lot of people who are able to use a great deal of money to try to reshape reality towards their own ends. I will say I've proudly worked for one of these people. I spent 15 years on various different charitable boards for George Soros and Open Society Foundation.
Wow.
And he's certainly an example of a super empowered individual. Whether or not, that fully fits your definition of oligarch, I think he fits a lot of definitions of oligarch. I think oligarchy has become a lot more common. And I think it is affecting industries a lot more directly than we've expected in the past. And in many ways, the example that I find myself coming back to is from the 1890s. It's when Hearst and Pulitzer were attempting to drag the US into the Spanish-American War. And it was not just the amazing amount of money they had, it was the informational power they had in controlling the large newspapers of the day. And so not only did you have someone who sort of had to be taken seriously because they had so many funds, because they had, indirect political power, they had direct power over the public sphere. And that direct power over the public sphere is an analogy that's really come to be the case, certainly for Elon Musk, for Zuckerberg, and arguably there's a sense in which Trump sort of went in the other direction. He sort of got the power and then turned himself into a tech oligarch. He's got his own quite powerful amplifiers at this moment in time.
There's been a lot of discussion, Ethan, right, about what happened at the inauguration. We saw three wealthiest people in the US, Mr. Musk, Mr. Zuckerberg, and Mr. Bezos, all there right behind or right next to Trump, along with many other folks, particularly in tech, CEOs of big tech companies, Sundar Pichai from Google, Tim Cook from Apple, others too. Now, that has been sort of bandied about as something that was not just an optics thing, that indicates a real affinity and synergy and alliance between the president and these people that have profound amounts of power, because it's not just economic power. They're controlling many of the infrastructures and platforms upon which we are living. What do you think of that? Do you think that was overstated, or do you think that there's some real change we're seeing in tech where it's moving in potentially an ethno-nationalist, authoritarian, Trumpian direction?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a single thing going on there. I think it's quite possible that what's actually going on is sort of complex and multi-layered. We have already seen what being up on that stage did for Tim Cook, which is when Trump decided to put 154% tariffs on China. Yeah. He was able to say, you're going to destroy my business. There's no way that I can move my supply chains, out from China at this point. You really don't want to be known as the president who's responsible for a $3,000 iPhone. And that's exactly what's going to happen if I have to do this. And in a way that looks a lot like bribery, was able to get those tariffs removed. There's a wonderful radio story on The Daily from the New York Times where they interview a small entrepreneur, had built a business doing manufacturing in China. She spends most of the episode explaining why it's so hard to do manufacturing in the United States. Her products she can no longer afford to bring into the US. And at the end of it, she sort of adds a footnote and essentially says, look, Apple is one of the companies that could conceivably build manufacturing facilities in the United States. They've got money in the bank. They're enormously profitable. They can, issue any number of bonds and be able to do it. And they're the ones who don't have to do it. I have no more credit. I'm going to lose my house, and the tariffs are going to harm me. So I think just in terms of sheer practicality and bribery, there's some outcomes. I think maybe less so when we look at Meta, right? Zuckerberg is still facing this suit. I don't think the suit's going to succeed. I think, unfortunately, the fact pattern of the suit is not particularly good. I think it's hard to make the argument of Meta's monopoly now that, say, TikTok has emerged as a global competitor on all of it. I think it would have been a much better case 5 or 6 years ago. I think it's a much harder case to make now. And thus far, Zuckerberg kissing the ring hasn't made that case go away. I think one of the questions to ask is whether certain technologies structurally promote oligarchy. So one of the interesting things is that, you and I come from a generation of tech utopians, right? People who
Absolutely.
basically felt like the internet was inherently hard to censor. It inherently empowered lots of individual voices. It was going to be a powerful democratizing force. What's happened instead is that for many people, despite the ways in which the internet architecture can democratize, there's been such a concentration of platform power, of advertising, of revenue. Companies like Meta have gotten so good at building platforms that we're not able to really link freely to, that it's very hard to escape their algorithms. To me, that vision of technology feels tremendously like an oligarchy. And I think one of the things we should be sure to talk about today is AI, which I think, if anything, may actually be more subject to oligarchy because of the technical architectures behind it.
No question about it. Our dear colleague Bob McChesney passed away recently, a huge
Sure.
influence on all of us and many of our other colleagues, and actually several of the guests on Utopias. And one thing that McChesney mentions is that the big tech platforms are essentially monopolies, and that there would be no possible way in which a global competitor to any of these could emerge for two reasons: not just network effects, that they have so many billions of users. So like how would you even compete with that, given that the value of the platforms for the most part are access to one another, but also that there have been so many patents. It seems like we're a bit in this sort of stuck in the mud point with tech platforms outside of even their connection to Trump. I mean, many of the parts of this conversation that we're having today could have also happened just several months ago before the inauguration.
I'm with Bob up to a point. I actually am not sure that monopoly is the best way to understand these platforms. It's not even the sort of, well, there's 2% that isn't on the platform, therefore it isn't a monopoly argument. I think they might be something different. And what I mean by that is monopolies should be capable of stifling innovation. They should be capable of forcing competitive products out of the market. I actually think TikTok has been this amazing example of, oh, no, there actually are new things that we can do. I mean, YouTube certainly had the market for video hosting, looked about as close to a monopoly as you could possibly get. Most people don't remember Daily Motion. But then something quite new came on the horizon, enough of a twist from what was going on that we had some competition within it. For me, that doesn't mean that we don't worry about Meta's power, we don't worry about Google's power, just because we've demonstrated that someone can come in and, provide some competition. I think the question may become just sheer concentration of power. It's very hard to get people to give up some of these spaces. It's really hard to get someone to give up Facebook. I remain on Facebook because a huge number of people in my life, put their updates on Facebook. It's not a monopoly in any traditional sense. There is competition. They're not jacking up prices. Those tests don't work super well. But looking at it instead of saying, oh, wow, Facebook now has an incredible amount of power over whether I'm going to see a news story or whether you're going to appear frequently in my feed or whether you're not going to appear very often. That's power, and how it is asserted feels like something that we should be paying attention to, whether or not the language of monopoly is part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I've even had conversations with various colleagues of ours about even looking at these things as utilities, right? Like Google, at least, is a word in the English language. At least there are ways to kind of try to push them to be non-discriminatory. But it's an important point. It's not like there is only Facebook and its products out there, but it's the power that the platforms have to essentially make decisions computationally about what we might desire, how we might behave, what we see, what we don't see. We could be presented with completely different worlds sitting right next to one another, being very similar to one another.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that I wanna hone in on that because one of the most important things about you and your story, Ethan, that I've known since I met you is how you came up very much as someone deeply invested in grassroots blogging, in citizen journalism. Remember that word? I remember
sure,
when I was
sure.
a student at the Media Lab, we used to use that word
Yeah,
25 years ago. And I remember your blog also. My heart is in Accra. I love Accra as well. This is the beautiful, beautiful thing about the internet, right? The capacity for all of us to share our voices and share our stories and speak about our experiences, political or otherwise, in a localized way and share that with others. So where are we at with all that?
yeah.
What's
So,
happened? Yeah.
so, so let's go back a little bit and let's think about maybe the power to speak and the power to amplify. Blogging's a very old phenomenon. It starts out with Jorn Barger probably in the late 1990s. Dave Weiner takes it up into a bit of a longer form in the early 2000s. There's people who are already doing it, just sort of editing their own web pages, possibly before Weiner puts software out there, but he puts together the RSS protocol, and that has an enormous amount to do with how the whole ecosystem evolves. The first folks to pick the technology up in a really big way are mostly political progressives in the US. And they feel like their voices aren't being heard by the Democratic Party, but now they feel like Howard Dean, the governor of Vermont, who's emerging as a progressive champion, is listening to them, and therefore their voices can be heard and they feel empowered. And there is something a little funny in retrospect about thinking about a whole bunch of mostly middle-aged white guys feeling like they didn't have enough voice and being excited about the technology that gave them more voice. But it was sincere, and I actually think it probably is a sincere problem not having sufficient voice in politics. Rebecca McKinnon and I were hanging out with a lot of these people in 2004, 2005, and I think increasingly got concerned that we weren't having dialogue about the global nature of this. We weren't talking about not just getting left and right voices and progressive and conservative voices, but we really wanted to be getting voices from the global south. So we started doing that work with Global Voices, and we thought some combination of amplifying and translating might change these things. And our goal initially was to try to get bloggers to influence the news ecosystem. So to get to the point where the New York Times was looking to bloggers to source stories. And to the extent that we had any success, it was during the Arab Spring. So suddenly everyone had to find somebody in Tunisia, somebody in Egypt. We knew a lot of those people. A lot of the people actually on our team were involved with the protests. For a very brief shining moment, we were able to sort of get amplification. But amplification increasingly was coming from Facebook, it was coming from Twitter, it was coming from these different algorithmic sources. And I wrote a book about 10 years ago called Rewire. And I think the title was sort of meant to have two implications to it. I wanted people to think about rewiring their own media universe, so they were paying attention more broadly. But I really wanted the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world to consider rewiring their sites so that we weren't just getting partisan echo chambers, or we weren't just getting news from our neighborhoods, we might be getting news from around the world. And what I thought was sort of a radical idea at the time was, wow, you could make a decision for a social network site, for a media aggregator to have a particular point of view. You could add some social intentionality to it. You could say, I'm going to try to make this in such a way that it tries to steer people towards cosmopolitanism, for instance. That idea got absolutely no traction. So I think it was a fine idea to put out there. Interestingly enough, you're seeing that idea emerge again a little bit with people experimenting with blue sky and sort of saying, maybe this is a moment where we create black sky and we try to work with communities to make sure that there's a great black Twitter-like feed on blue sky. Maybe there will be other communities where we amplify points of view that we really need to hear from. But it's very late. And it's better than never. But this was a conversation that we needed to be having 20 years ago. I tried to spark 10 years ago. Maybe we're finally getting around to having it now, but it still feels like a conversation that we're very much on the fringes of.
I think Rewire is a great book. I actually read the entire book shortly after it came out, and I wrote about it extensively, or at least toward the end of my first book, Whose Global Village, and it spoke to that again, that sort of idealism that you and I shared, and I hope still share. That we got to do everything we can to push and transform these digital ecosystems so that they are not zero sum, that they don't just serve corporate overloads or investors, but they can also serve all of us as consumers, as users, as workers, all of these things.
I think part of what's tricky about this, Ramesh, is we do have to acknowledge that there's limits to what individuals are able to do. You and I suspect, make all sorts of efforts to be hearing from a variety of people. I, these days, often point my students towards a mailing list that I'm on called The Writing. And The Writing is a selection of right-wing news stories and blog posts from sort of mainstream sources like the Wall Street Journal and Fox News all the way sort of out to the fringe. And it's put together by a left-leaning critic who wants to make sure that we're aware of these narratives. And I read it for at least two things. I read it to sort of see the narratives, but I also read it very much with an eye towards, do I agree with any of these arguments? And every so often I do. I wish we had one that was giving the view from Botswana, the view from Mongolia. I try to get that in my own consumption. But I'm also increasingly aware that the algorithmic thumb on the scale is just very, very powerful. X appears to have created an enormous amount of traffic for Alternative for Deutschland. And there's argument about whether all it did was increase traffic for Musk, and because Musk is pro AfD, or whether it actually supported AfD more broadly. But it is a sign of how much power is within those things. X at least is, it's not easy to audit. You have to do it by scraping it because they've disabled their API. It's even harder to audit something like Facebook or Meta. And our ability to sort of interrogate these algorithms and have an intelligent conversation about what are they doing for us, that, we're really quite far from that right now, unfortunately.
Yeah, I often sort of say in more public talks, and I'm sure you say stuff similarly, like, hey, my friends, we all have friends at Meta and Google and all these companies. But I often say, maybe more to the higher ups, like, what if you did some A/B testing where you gave us an opportunity to see geographically distributed content, or to see content that represents multiple political perspectives, which, you can probably algorithmically at least approximate somehow, and just see, does that actually destroy your engagement metrics? Like, let's just do some A/B testing around that. I always try to position it more as like, let's design stuff. Let's just do like fun little testing. Let's do that playful thing that was really what made Silicon Valley what it was. And companies like Apple in their early days were all about that. I'll just ask you this, I think we're way ahead of the curve on this one too, because I remember a piece you wrote for CNN shortly after the election of President Trump in his first term, and it was called "Normalizing the Abnormal." I remember this. Look, we just saw a study come out from Media Matters that basically showed that so-called legacy media or institutional media, what you and I were sort of critiquing as not being as globally focused, and
Sure.
also manufacturing consent on some level, as Noam Chomsky critiqued, kind of making choices about what to cover and what not to cover, and covering the sort of the interests of those in power. So we were all concerned about that. But now we're seeing this study, and Angela from Media Matters I saw was making the rounds, and basically the study he was showing showed that basically people's consumption of so-called new media, especially in the podcast world, tend to go toward fringe content, and it's dominated by now, for including for younger people. Everyone says, okay, CNN, you're boring. MSNBC, you're kind of saying the same thing all the time. I mean, it's true, they're pretty boring to watch for me
Sure.
too.
Sure.
I'm hosting the Young Turks, so literally right after our conversation. I think they are one of only like two or three new media networks that are even close to competitive with the top 10 to 20 of the kind of more right-leaning content, from Candace
Absolutely.
Owen stuff to, of course, Joe Rogan and all of it.
Yep.
So what is going on here? Yeah.
Yeah. I really appreciate you bringing this up because I do think this is a really radical shift that's sort of taking place at the moment. I think it started early on with the rise of Trump. I think QAnon had a lot to do with it. I think it spread much further during the pandemic, and I think it's now kind of characteristic of our media landscape. And what it basically comes down to is that there's not a very strong factual anchor for our public sphere in the United States anymore. People end up looking at tough factual questions. I'm going to start by being scrupulously fair, and then I'm going to move into the more political side of it. But there are tough factual questions. For me, a really tough factual question is, once we knew that few children were dying of COVID, and once we had a reasonable suspicion that not being in school was going to be bad for those kids in a variety of different ways, should we have reopened schools, or should we have continued social distancing in that way because of the vulnerability of teachers and staff and because of the vulnerability of the homes that children were coming back to? In a healthy society, we should be able to have that conversation. We may disagree radically about it, but we should be capable of looking at different forms of information, interrogating them, going back and forth. Where we've ended up is that because of the explosion of information and opinion on the internet, we can now choose the information sources we want, and we end up choosing sources that sort into universes to minimize cognitive dissonance. And so for a while, there was sort of an alternative health sphere where you could sort of say, I actually think masking maybe isn't great. Maybe we shouldn't be masking our children. And you would find other things that you might find at a normal health store, or sort of other people maybe on the left thinking about things. That universe expanded to the point where it's now MAGA in many ways. I had this funny experience. I've been nursing a bad knee injury. I tore my meniscus, and I'm trying to rehab my knee. And my local physical therapist has gone full MAGA from the left. So she sort of went during the pandemic and went all the way through alternative health, and has now sort of gone over to the other side. And she's a nice person. She's my neighbor. She's a very good physical therapist. We do not agree on these things, but I can kind of see her progress down that particular path. I think a lot of people have gone down various different paths, and some are as absurd as QAnon and concluding that there's a pedophile basement under Comet Ping Pong, and those ones are easy to parody. But I think we've ended up with a whole lot of other fracturing universes. And what ends up happening is that if you end up sort of feeling very strongly about one particular issue, you find yourself hanging out with this cognitively consistent group. And you may find yourself picking up another belief system because you're suddenly encountering a lot of that same information. My friend Taylor Owen up at McGill University in Canada did a study of Canada's last election. So before this election, he was really worried that mis and disinformation coming up from America was going to end up screwing up Canadian elections. And that time, it's about 5 years ago, he said, no, not so much. Actually, CBC seems to be acting as a factual anchor for us. It's got good reach. It gives everyone at least a common set of facts. He's now studying the upcoming Canadian elections, and he goes, yeah, that's gone. The Canadians are no longer watching CBC. They're no longer paying as much attention to it. They are paying attention to this same sort of stream of thought authenticity. And I put authenticity in quotes because I think a lot of this is performance of authenticity. But this sort of new media that is sorting us into ideological camps based on, what end up fact patterns we end up seeing. I'm early on in thinking and writing about this. I want to spend more time on it, but maybe I'll sort of toss back to you. Is that intersecting at all with sort of how you're seeing that thing, or am I being too generous to the propagandists and the disinfo merchants here?
Oh no, I think it's a very, very appropriate analysis because, like, I'll give an example. We all have friends we saw support Senator Sanders in 2016, even some who supported Senator Sanders in 2020 when I worked on that campaign, who were kind of like asking questions about vaccines. Somehow, someone like RFK was magnetizing to them. I mean, I was hoping someone like Marianne Williamson would have been magnetizing to them because Marianne Williamson speaks to those worlds, yet is also, in my opinion, very righteous in her views and keeps it real. This term conspirituality started to emerge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's not left, right. It's more populist versus establishment. And when we consider establishment elite or legacy, anything that's perceived as elite or unfortunately institutional is seen as corrupted. And instead, you're actually going to trust things that are highly close to inauthentic, if not totally inauthentic, like QAnon, and that instead plays to your affect and goes viral because of predictions of engagement. And that's why, that's what at least my friends at the Young Turks always say is like, we're populist. Of course, we're left progressive, whatever, but forget the left right thing. And it's just about getting people excited and emotional. And so this is a big issue because the key of democracy, John Stuart Mill himself says this, is not just whatever representative voting, which is not even direct democracy. It's the ability to have dialogue. The ability to have dialogue. You called it the public sphere earlier. So I just wonder where we go and our tech brethren don't seem to be taking too much responsibility over any of this. We got to figure out a way to talk to one another and recognize our fates are intertwined in this country and around the world. But I don't think the folks in the tech world want to deal with that. I don't know. I'm curious what you think.
So let's back up a little bit to the populist versus institutionalist. And I'm going to use the words that I like, although they got me into a lot of trouble because my book Mistrust came out directly on the heels of January 6th. But the words that I used in that book were institutionalist and insurrectionist. And the distinction that I basically drew there was, do you think the work we need to do is mostly on working within the institutions, making them stronger, bringing them back to their principles, or do we need to throw out some of these institutions and come up with new ones? And it's possible to be a left institutionalist or a right institutionalist. The vast majority of people who were involved with politics, say in 2016, on both sides of the aisle, were institutionalists. What's been a little tricky in some ways is that the Democratic Party has sorted itself into left institutionalists. Hillary Clinton is the paradigmatic left institutionalist. Sanders, AOC, Liz Warren, to a certain extent, get a little closer to left insurrectionist. Many, many, many right institutionalists, almost none in the party anymore. They're not Republicans. That's become a fully insurrectionist party. this is a good moment for insurrectionists. A lot of things are really messed up right now. We are facing enormous climate change. We are facing incredible economic inequality to the point where a lot of the sort of promises of what America means are not particularly believable to people younger than we are. We ended up watching a fight between a left institutionalist and a right insurrectionist, and it was insurrection that won. One of the things, sort of connecting this to the media environment, is that insurrectionists do real well with portraying authenticity, whereas institutionalists have a tough time because, like, who authentically wants to say we need a strong government accountability office? It's critically important that we actually have a balance of Republicans and Democrats on the FTC, right? Like that's where the institutionalist argument comes up. So we had this right insurrectionist point of view come into power and start smashing things. He started smashing things in 2016. There were enough institutionalists who still had their hands on power to sort of restrain them. We are now looking at what a right insurrectionist could do in power. And it's quite possible that one of the things that's going to get smashed is our economies. You and I both teach. It sure looks like universities are on the smash list. So it's a bit of a crazy moment. The trick is, I don't know that the right response, which was the Dems' response in 2016, was to say, we must defend the institutions. There was this really weird moment around 2018 where you had like Democrats essentially going, go FBI. We are not generally pro FBI, right? That's not normally where leftist politics goes.
No.
But we were just desperate for any of these sort of institutions to hold. I think what we maybe didn't realize, Ramesh, was we're at a point where many, many people feel like the systems are so unfair and doing such a poor job of addressing people's needs that people are demanding real change. If the only people promising real change essentially step up and say, we're just going to smash everything, some people are going to be willing to give that a try.
Yeah, and in their case, it's smashing everything that working and middle class people rely upon, and including the potential
No
destruction
disagreement for me. No disagreement for me.
Yeah, and potential like austerity style, like the destruction of, except this is coming from a supposedly insurrectionist kind of perspective, as opposed to austerity in Europe, which was coming from a kind of an elite institutionalist perspective. It's very helpful to look at things that way. It's not just sort of saying, hey, the FBI is good. It's a good institution. It's also saying, hey, Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney are, like, hey, let's cling to that, or that's kind of the good old America. So, if we're going kind of insurrectionist versus institutionalist, and now we're sort of letting tech folks, some people use terms like oligarchy, whatever that,
Yeah, yeah.
to kind of take over this Department of Government Efficiency, who are basically not trained to actually look at
No, they're the
like
wrecking crew.
a wrecking crew.
Yeah.
And typical of many engineers, we both know how in engineering, sometimes you are not trained in things outside of engineering. You might have an HCI class or something, but you're not trained in the EPA. You're not trained in the Federal Aviation's Mission. You're not trained in Social Security. And so we're sort of sitting at this point where the insurrectionist energy is actually going to be used to actually support the most elite interests, ultimately with massive tax cuts, and wreck the very few things that middle and working class people can count on.
I think this is what's so tricky about this moment. Once you start looking at this in a two-dimensional grid and start saying, the truth is, a lot of the successes of the left have been institutional successes, right? The Great Society is an institutional success, right? It's basically sort of saying we're going to create safety nets, not European safety nets, but we're going to create sufficient safety nets that people feel like they can get somewhere. Civil rights is a set of institutionalist victories. We're going to institute in law protections against discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. It makes perfect sense that the left would lean towards institutionalist points of view. The problem is that institutions get stuck. They reach a point where they're not as efficient as they were in getting work done. They end up with significant, sustained, known bugs. And you need the chance to sort of clean them up. One of the examples that I ended up giving in Mistrust is that there are police departments that have lost so much trust from their community, they cannot effectively police. You do, in those cases, have to defund the police. You probably don't defund the police and leave nothing in its wake, but what you might do is what some towns have done, which is essentially fire the majority of the force, get in new management, selectively rehire, and change policing strategy. That sort of institutional reform probably does make real sense. There may be some institutions of the government that need radical reinvention. I suspect you and I would both agree that there are parts of universities that need radical reinvention. Ripping everything down is not radical reinvention. It's just the destruction associated with it. The trick is you get to a point where populations are so mistrustful of the institutions that aren't meeting their needs that seem to have created a system that feels systemically rigged against you, that you can end up rooting for the insurrectionists, even if what the insurrectionists end up doing causes you an enormous amount of harm.
Yeah, like let's look at two insurrections, in the not distant history,
Sure.
the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street. Both
Sure.
kind of progressive insurrectionist movements to the most part. The Ikhwan, of course, in Egypt, or the Muslim Brotherhood was maybe not, we might not call them progressive, but wanting to depose Mubarak. And the big challenge, at least what I saw when I was doing field work in 2011 to 2013 in Egypt was, oh my gosh, how do we institutionalize the energy of this insurrectionist movement? What do we replace Mubarak with?
Yeah.
Occupy something sort of similar. I think the Sanders kind of campaign, even though he has been around forever, kind of came out or kind of emerged. This guy became kind of the face of that. But again, it wasn't really institutionalized because he was sort of friendly, but sort of not with the Democratic Party. He wasn't able to take it over, or didn't decide to create a third party. Or we look at the Black Lives Matter movement, the incredible, profound frustration many of us feel
Sure.
that nothing, well, maybe some things changed, but it didn't feel like not much changed. So yet on the other side, we sort of see how the MAGA social movement, certainly an insurrectionist social movement, was able to somehow be institutionalized. And I wonder how that happened versus other movements not having that happen.
Yeah. So you just put a lot out there, and I sort of feel like we have to unpack
Yeah,
it
that was a lot.
a little bit in sequence. The way that I understand the Arab Spring at this point is really through Zainab Tufeshi. So her wonderful book, Twitter and Tear Gas, basically says it's gotten much, much easier to build a movement than it used to be. What you get out of it, though, are very different movements. You get movements that may not have very deep roots. They may be quite shallow, they may be quite vulnerable. There's a lot of alliances of convenience that sort of come into play there. And so I think a big part of what happened with the Arab Spring was that we did have enormous mobilization. We had incredible resistance to dictatorship. But what we ended up with when governments were toppled was a power vacuum. In Egypt, it went very, very badly. In a power vacuum, the next most powerful force will kick in. First, it was the Muslim Brotherhood, then it was the army. Tunisia's had a rougher, a more complex path. There have been many more positive steps on it. It's not in a place that I think a lot of people feel terrific about. Again, you were dealing with a society where civil society had been crippled for generations, and it's very hard to sort of build these things back. As much as I am aligned with the goals of Occupy as much as I consider myself aligned with the Black Lives Matter movement. These were primarily protest movements. And protest requires a theory of change. The way that I try to teach this to people is the March on Washington was a march on Washington, right? It was designed to pressure Kennedy to make certain decisions about civil rights because leaders had pressured him in a particular way. This was the challenge with the Women's March in the inauguration of Donald Trump. He doesn't care. There is no influencing him. There is no version of many, many women are in the streets and they want you, not to be a misogynist bastard anymore. And, the answer is no. So where I think the right has been very successful as insurrection is that they use protest much less. They use it somewhat performatively, but they're much better about figuring out how to get the hands on the levers of power. And in many cases, what they're then doing is, unscrewing the levers. They stick them in where they want them, and then they sort of make sure that no one else can move them. So I think in some ways, we've almost had left promises of insurrection, and now we're seeing real right insurrection. I'd be thrilled to see genuine left insurrection, but genuine left insurrection would have been, can we seize the DA's offices? Can we recruit an army of progressives to go into the police and fix that institution? Why are there no progressive prison wardens, right? Like that would be a really interesting sort of insurrectionist piece of this. We have seen the right go after school boards. We have seen them go after, sort of other institutions where they've come in and said, this is where the power is, and these are the issues that we want to have control over.
It's also I want to kind of speak to you about this sense of where we all go from here. So look, we are now seeing insurrectionist rhetoric and discourse and language directly tied to Trump somehow, even though he is the most powerful person in the world, if not the country. We see Steve Bannon using terms like techno-feudalism, which is a term that Yanis Varoufakis, recent guest on this podcast, I don't know if he coined it, but he's well known for discussing
certainly
that.
Promoted it, yes.
We see Steve Bannon describing kind of scientific and tech breakthroughs, referring to Thomas Kuhn. So us academics who are all whatever.
Structure scientific revolutions.
Yeah, we love that stuff.
Favorite book, yeah.
So sort of like the insurrectionist, the kind of critical energy is all like, it seems like it's all being Pac-Maned up by this sort of panoply of the wealthiest person in the history of the world, like someone who's quite clearly corrupt and dishonest all the time in the presidency, and this, kind of propagandist who is exquisite at it. And somehow, even though they are all very different from one another, the sort of energy feels sucked up by all of it. And I guess my question is, none of us have the answers, but is like, what the heck do we do about all this? Not just in general, but also in terms of our media and our tech.
Yeah, so I feel like I'm fairly early on in figuring out some of this, because I really do think we're in a very, very different situation than we were 2 or 3 months ago. I feel like Trump 1 is actually not especially good preparation for Trump 2. I feel like something quite different has gone on. I've tried analogies like, QAnon doesn't exist anymore, it's in the White House. That's a bit of an oversimplification and a quip. But I'll tell you a story. I texted a close friend, someone I've worked with on many, many different issues, who is a Democratic Party insider. This was 2 months ago, and I said, "Where are you? Like, what's going on? Like, what are we going to do? Who's going to lead?" And he said, "Look, we're scared. Polling sort of suggests that the voters hate us, and that anything we say, they see as packaged and insincere. We don't know how to talk anymore. And so don't expect any of our political leaders on the left to get us out of this, it's going to have to come from someone who understands this medium. And he, being my friend, then sort of said, so you fix it. You're a comm scholar. Figure out what the hell is going on here. And so I've been wrestling with this ever since. And I do think there's something that happened during the pandemic. I think a lot of us started sharing very raw parts of our life. Like, I think it wasn't just like influencer culture. I'm going to be on Instagram so that I can sell you something. I think there was a lot of fairly raw, here's what I'm going through. I think this is the moment where you see these long form podcasts start to rise. You see this sort of video game streaming, which had been a thing within geek subculture, kind of become a mainstream thing. It's this very authentic, or at least authentic seeming performance. And I think we are wired in a very particular way to take this sort of authenticity seriously. There are certain rules of authenticity. It's really hard to sit on a podcast for 3 hours and shoot the shit and be scripted the whole time. When Rogan is getting high and 3 hours into an interview with a guest, there is the sense that you are getting the real sort of unfiltered what's going on. You may find this impossible to listen to. I often find this impossible to listen to, but it has an interesting way of reading. And I think that authenticity has an enormous amount of power and appeal right now. Second, I think it's possible to fake authenticity through this one weird trick, which is putting forward your worst self. I think when people go out and they're racist or misogynist or bitter or confrontational or any number of these other things, it reads as authentic. And it reads as authentic as, why would he be portraying himself that way unless that was in fact real? I think there are people who are going to listen to this as two guys who have strong progressive credentials, who work really hard on this, who are going to say, all you guys are doing are virtue signaling. You don't actually believe any of this shit. You're just trying to, feed me this. There's something about the ways in which we're talking and the ways in which we're using media that aren't connecting with some of these audiences that have become very important, like some of these disengaged young men.
Yeah, just like civility and thinking through things and reasoning and discussing things versus a more affective response, an angry response, a burn it all down response is somehow seems authentic somehow, right? It's absolutely. I want to ask you about some of the kind of theorists, we could call them, maybe we could call them philosophers, who seem to be influencing some major figures in tech. Of course, notably folks like Peter Thiel, but others as well. People like Curtis Yarvin, we hear him on the New York Times Daily, which you alluded to. I mean, I've personally found it philosophically quite unimpressive and uninteresting, but not to be, and I'm not trying to be an elite by saying that, because I'm about to go on the Young Turks and we're going to yell and scream, right? Or Nick Land, who has somewhat similar sort of incredibly cynical views. I guess I want to ask you about those forces. And then this is, I'm sort of tying these questions together. But, if you had power, or we have power, or like all of us have power, the demos has power to enact various specific changes with media and tech, whether in this country or around the world, what would be the most important things we could do or should be done?
Sure. So let's do the Dark Enlightenment, and then let's get over to reform. Yarvin and a lot of these Dark Enlightenment guys have been around for a long time. They are evidently highly influential on someone like J.D. Vance. You can hear Yarvin in Vance fairly often, and therefore it's probably good to pay close attention to this, because this is clearly a strong ingredient that's sort of coming into play. I found myself a couple years ago probably now, at a conference at Harvard on digital democracy. And a lot of the conference was basically, how do we get the Democratic Party to win? And there were a bunch of the rest of us sort of going, it really feels like we should be having a much broader conversation. Can we talk about who are these guys like Yarvin coming up and making a case for not just oligarchy, but in his case, monarchy. I mean, he literally wants a monarchy and is very worried about what's happening to us without one. And I came out of that meeting saying, all right, I teach a class on defending democracy. I want to read some of these guys, and I want to figure out how to teach some of these guys. And I had some of the problems that you had, which is they're really long-winded. They read better when you have an AI summarize them than when you sort of just read them straight up. And at the end of the day, I'm not actually sure that they're nearly as interesting as some of the people that they're citing, going back to old arguments to protect monarchy from, before the emergence of the United States. So I think I see them as a symbol of this insurrectionist moment. There are people who are so dissatisfied with what's going on right now that having someone stand up and say, how about a monarch? At least people are willing to go, hey, let's hear him out. And I think we should take that very seriously. Like, that's a really worrisome thing that there are people saying, let's go hear that out. I think we should read these folks. I think we should look at it and sort of say, I'm pretty mistrustful of anyone who tells me that they're much smarter than me and therefore part of a cognitive ruling class that, is superior to all others. There feels like a lot of, we are the divinely chosen in a lot of this work. And I think people should be very, very suspicious of that. But this maybe puts us in a position to sort of pivot towards media ecosystems. I don't know that there's any turning back to previous media ecosystems in which we had a small number of highly trusted sources. I do think anchoring our media ecosystems is probably pretty critical. I think the one anchor that we have at this point that almost everybody finds themselves eventually holding onto is Wikipedia. And this is one of the reasons why I've seen these right-wing attacks on Wikipedia as being so scary. We lose that tether and there's the center will not hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. I also think you can't just have Wikipedia because while it's fantastic at sort of finding its way to a consensus truth, it's not a terrific communicative platform. So there's got to be some way of building multiple actors that are using some of the techniques we've used for the years on journalism to go out and find the truth. I think these things are going to be slower. I think one of the things is speed. It's really hard to be right immediately. It's much easier to be right over time. So I think anchoring these things over time as we know more about them, as we've investigated our way to them, and doing a lot more of this sort of long form explanation. Why do so many people think tariffs are a terrible idea? What are the arguments behind tariffs? How might that possibly work? What have we found out sort of coming from this so far? If those things can act as anchors, I think that could be very helpful. The next thing I think we need to do is give people a lot better control over their information environment. The proposal that we've been working on over in my lab and sort of building pieces of is we don't think it's going to work to get everybody to quit Facebook or quit X or quit, you can't sort of say step one, everyone quit and join my new thing. Instead, what you actually have to do is recognize that media is going to be a pluriverse. People are going to look in a whole lot of different areas, and you need tools to manage that pluriverse. You need a social media client where you have control over the algorithms, you can choose between them, you can tune them. And we need to make it very, very easy for people to start new social networks. Some of them will be political and serious, some of them will just be fun. We've spent a bunch of time in our lab, mostly a wonderful developer named Mike Sugarman, releasing a new network called Freak.social, which is literally a music recommendation network. What are you listening to? Why do you love it? It's one of the healthiest little communities I've sort of seen spring up recently. It's getting a lot of traction within college radio stations and DJ communities. We're thinking about, does that become a toolkit for people sort of starting their own social media spaces? So anchors, factual anchors, a variety of spaces, big ones and small ones, where people can have these conversations, more control over our tools. And then I think the last thing that I would say in this, Ramesh, is that we all have to think real hard about how communication changes with each of these revolutions. I think there's a revolution that had a lot to do with COVID and had a lot to do with short video that's really changed how we communicate. And I think a lot of us who try to work as activists just haven't caught up with it. We are text people. The best that we can get is we can do hour and a half long podcasts, but we're not real good at 30 seconds of image and video and short, sharp, and snarky. We're terrible at it. Academics take 1,500 words to introduce ourselves. So we got to figure out some of these new media. And by the way, we're going through another shift because very realistically, AI-enabled search tools are going to become the next medium that gets sort of conquered in this ongoing propaganda war.
Yeah, it's the reels and the clips, and everything is audio visual. There are a lot of questions being asked about whether we, not just you and I, but like just all of us, read, and the distinction between reading a tweet or a short post on Blue Sky relative to reading an article, relative to reading a book. These are all very different reading practices. There's also a lot of questions being asked about whether we write anymore. And here's now I'm going to kind of transition to discuss AI with you. So I actually think of you as someone who, like, on a very personal level, has a lot of ethics and a lot of integrity. And feel free to share as you wish on this subject. But you've been involved in lawsuits relative to Meta. You also very, very early on, you were a professor at my master's alma mater, the MIT Media Lab, which quite frankly, for me, when I was a master's student, I found depressing. I did have a punk show at the MIT radio station, but you've been trying. I sense that you, in your own life and in your own choices as a human being, first and foremost, have been trying to make choices that are devoted to ethics and integrity in our institutions as well as with our media. And I want to just ask you to kind of comment on those things because, I personally kind of followed your decision to leave the MIT Media Lab early when the Epstein revelations were revealed. So I guess I just want to ask you about you having that type of integrity to make those choices and being someone who really did, you were leading a civic media group at the MIT Media Lab. It was the only place where I felt like I could fit when I was coming and visiting the Media Lab, again, which I graduated from. That's why when I would come give talks, I'd be like, Ethan, can you organize it? Because, that you are my people. So I want to ask you about those choices you made and are continuing to make and your work at UMass Amherst. I want to ask you about that, and then we'll end discussing AI.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm honored that you see me in that light, and I appreciate that. To be perfectly honest, the Epstein decision was a very easy decision. I really only talked to two people about it. I talked to my wife and I talked to one of my best friends. And my dear friend, Janet Haven, who runs Data and Society, said, obviously you're going to leave. Like, you can't work in our world unless you leave. And it was interesting. It was just so bluntly stated. It was sort of like there's no way that you can work with the social justice communities that you care about if you can't take an unambiguous stance on something like Epstein. And so for me, it was super easy. Like that was clearly the right thing to do. The truth is, a lot of my other concerns about MIT, was it a healthy place for the students who were there? Was it a healthy place for the faculty there? I had been sticking around despite my doubts through really two things. One, this sense of it's a hard thing to walk away from. There's so much prestige associated with institutions like that it's very hard to say no to. And then at a certain point, I was deep enough in a situation where I felt like I was trying to protect the people in my own circle. So all of it was incredibly helpful as far as sort of clarifying how you balance those things. I have a much easier time at UMass than I did at MIT because I think most of the organization's priorities are much better aligned with mine. One of the things that our dean of the computer sciences college likes to talk about here is that we educate more programmers than any other institution in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And we probably ought to be thinking about educating ethical ones. And so that's a value for us. And then we have to, doesn't mean that I don't get into conflicts. We had a really ferocious faculty meeting today. We're still kind of all licking our wounds from it. But I think for the most part, the values here are much more in line. That gets really important in a moment like this, where universities are under such attack, and we're very worried about these sort of literal problems of, are our students safe? Sort of where do we go with these things? My thought at this point is just trying to spend more time with the institutions where I'm on the right, where I don't have to fight quite as hard. Being in a situation where I sincerely thought some other faculty were going to resign from the Media Lab when I did, and the only one who resigned was my doctoral student, Nate Matthias. For me, that was this sort of realization of, I probably shouldn't be spending as much energy on this institution. And so I think that question of sort of finding how we align ourselves with institutions that are valued aligned, I think that's very straightforward. I think the flip side is that powerful institutions are exactly the ones that we sort of have to change. And a number of people have told me, including some of the students I had at the time, that they were sad and disappointed that there wasn't going to be a Center for Civic Media at MIT anymore. And unfortunately, that was one of the prices of making that decision.
Well, I appreciate that you made that choice and Nate made that choice, and and we have a community of publicly engaged scholars who care deeply about these issues. So, I'll wrap up. This is the first of time you've joined the podcast, but the podcast is called Utopias, as you know, the term even the book itself was a satire, but it was about kind of looking toward a world that is not just about critique and feeling like we have no agency, but actually really thinking about this sort of vision of that it's in service of democracy and of creativity, of care, of the best things we are as human beings and the best things that life is about, in my opinion. So we know that the horse is way out of the barn when it comes to generative AI. We also know how different this generative AI is than the AI systems I was building when I was a student of Marvin Minsky's, who also was connected to Jeffrey Epstein. And of course, we also know what happened with social media, that it went more, about 10 plus years ago. There was some debate. Our colleagues of ours like Clay Shirky and others and even Yochai Benkler and others were sort of saying, hey, this could go the direction of Wikipedia, right? Basically
Sure.
paraphrasing what they're saying. It didn't. We all see that. We're also now seeing that these generative AI systems are flattening informational diversity, potentially major challenges to economic welfare for many, many, and potentially replacing. I can have this podcast interview with the AI of Ethan Zuckerman.
Yeah.
That's horrifying to me personally, but I'm just sharing my opinions. So this last question I want to end with is sort of a utopian question. Like, what is a vision you have for AI and tech generally, knowing where we're at, where it can be used for good, where it can really kind of try to deliver upon what we both and what this podcast cares about?
So as it happened, last night I was at the Museum of Science in Boston. It's actually right on the Boston-Cambridge line. It's not far from where you used to be in Kendall Square. And I was moderating a discussion that had been put together by the Perkins School for the Blind. Perkins School is this amazing institution, been around since the early 1800s. Much of what it means to be a blind person in the world, including Braille, including the ability to publish in Braille, many different mobility aspects, these things come from Perkins. And Perkins continues to have 200 students between age 3 and 22, about 800 staff who are helping those students, many of whom are blind, deaf, many of whom are dealing with other mobility challenges like cerebral palsy. It's amazing stuff. And I got to share the stage with Kim Charlson, who is the librarian there, who is blind and who has been an advocate for voting rights for the blind. And she started our event by talking about when she first, got the right to vote, she literally had to go in her polling place with a Democratic and Republican representative both watching over her shoulder to verify her vote. And it's taken 20 years to get to the point where she actually has an accessible, secret, private ballot that she can vote on. We also had the CIO of the city of Boston, who is using AI in incredibly thoughtful, smart ways for the disability community. There are lots and lots of long documents coming out of meeting notes. He realized they're basically impossible for someone dealing with a screen reader. So he's done very careful studies to do 20-word AI summaries of different things that have come out. And it turns out that it's not just great for people who are visually impaired, it's kind of great for all of us. He's now working with, very specialized domain Gen AIs that let you ask questions of a data set, maybe verbally, rather than trying to see the visualizations, which again, great for people who are blind, great for us in general. I also caught a talk yesterday by Arvind Narayan, who argued that we need to start seeing AI as normal technology. And putting aside the word normal, which I don't love, what he's really trying to say is it's not magic. It's not going to eliminate all of our jobs. It's not going to take over and kill us. It's another technology. It's like electricity. It's like the internet. It's like social media. It's going to transform some things, and we should figure out where to go with it. And so I put those two together. I put together, Santi, who is the CIO of Boston, who's looking at normal AI and trying to use it in ways that makes democracy more inclusive, bring more people to the table, open up the information. And for me, that's about as much of a utopia as I'm willing to go on it. My fears about AI are that it's an inherently plutocratic and conservative technology. That because so much of AI is learning from the data we've already generated, because so much of the world that we live in has terrible biases, terrible prejudices associated with it that get echoed in code, because it requires so much money, so many resources, that it's creating a whole new space of oligarchs, I'm definitely more worried than I am optimistic. But if I want a utopia, I would look at what AIs are already doing for the blind, or for any number of other people who are not able to have full inclusion, but for whom these technologies often can really lower barriers to entry.
It's such a good point, Ethan. When we think about design, it's often powerful to think about designing for those most on the margins as kind of an initial part of one's design practice, to then recognize, once we've kind of engaged in those design challenges, how we can build stuff that actually supports those who might even be less marginalized than those who we start with, right? And this is our mutual friend, colleague, Sasha Costanza-Chuck's
Sure, of
book,
course.
Design Justice, is really all about that
Absolutely.
vision of that. Ethan, my deepest thanks for joining us on
What a
Utopias.
great conversation. Really enjoyed talking with you, Ramesh. I'm so glad we got some time together, and let's do it again soon.
Thank you so much, Ethan. Thank you for joining us again. Hi, everybody. Your support means the world to us. Our podcast is really focused on creativity, on care, on stories of inspiration, and inspiring characters of all kinds. It's such a wonderful, wonderful way to reach community. This is a labor of love. So the real way we can sustain ourselves is through all of your support. Please rate, ideally 5 stars. Please share this with anyone and everyone you know. And feel free to reach out to us also with suggestions on guests. Reach us at podcastutopias@gmail.com. Thank you, everybody, for your support.